Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is the sustainability and responsible sourcing section of the show. We had a great panel earlier about sustainability and how that impacts the bottom line, and I'm going to carry on sort of on the same theme and talk about how responsible sourcing impacts your bottom line. As Jason said, we at RAP have been proud to be longtime supporters of ATSC from its very inception. And one of the things that sold us on this show was that they, from the beginning, said we want to have this be part of the conversation that we have during the seminar series. This is not a, Johnny-come-lately to the show organizers. This is something that they realize is part and parcel of getting it right. And so it's important as we get these sourcing shows and all the networking and all the education and all the connections that are being made to also include in those conversations the idea, the importance of sustainability, of responsible sourcing. And so that's why we're happy to be partners and proud to be on the stage to share with you some of our thoughts on these issues. As I said, my talk today is going to be about how responsible sourcing impacts your bottom line. Now, I'm going to go about this a little bit differently than usual. Those of you who have seen me present know I like to have, a detailed agenda, and I'm a bit of a stickler to here's what I'm going to tell you, and then I tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then we can talk about what I told you. But I'm going to have more of a conversation this time, if you will. Partly because I get tired of the old way, and partly because it's late in the day, and the last thing you need is another, lecture. Not that we've had that today. The panels have been great. I've really enjoyed being part of the show today. So we're going to start talking a little bit about the evolution of bottom line as a notion, right? Because if we're going to understand how responsible sourcing impacts your bottom line, it's important to understand what that bottom line has come to mean. So traditionally, let's start with this guy first. I'm going to play a game with you all. Who knows who this is? Maybe you guys are being nice that you didn't read the answer that came up a second ago. This is Milton Friedman. He was an economist. He passed on about a dozen years ago. But Milton Friedman is famous for one particular line from a particular paper he wrote in 1970, where he said, "The business of business is business." Right. This was in 1970, so give him a break. But his point was at the time that the only thing a business should be focused on is maximizing its profits. Right? That's what responsibility means. And he was, to be fair, in particular talking about publicly traded corporations, right? So the business of business is business, which means if you're a public company, your job, and your only job, and your really only socially responsible thing to do is to maximize your profits for your shareholders, which is consistent with what began really as the original definition of bottom line, literally coming from the bottom line. Now this is not working very well for me. Let me go back to this. Here we go. From the bottom line of your financial statements, right? That's what bottom line is, net profit, right? That's how we defined it originally. That's how economists began, looking at it, and that's what Milton Friedman meant by saying the business of business is business, which means what you need to focus on is maximizing that bottom line. That's it. That's what social responsibility means to a business. Grow your profits for your shareholders. But then over the years, over the last several decades, our conception of what business value is has evolved. And that has been led primarily by the evolution of the concept of intangible assets, right? Not simply cash, which is reflected in that bottom line, what that net profit figure is, but also what else does the business have that creates value for those shareholders? Because Milton Friedman's fundamental proposition was that you're responsible to those shareholders. You got to maximize the value of the company to them, which you do, in his mind, by maximizing profits. But in the 80s, into the 90s, we evolved our thinking on what value is and began to understand that some companies have things that are valuable other than cash. And that includes, above all, the brand itself, right? You can look at some of the biggest brand names in the world, the Disneys, the Coca-Colas, the Apples, and you will recognize that there is value in that logo that isn't necessarily captured entirely by how much cash they have in the bank. So that notion then led to a rethinking of what the bottom line will mean and how you maximize value to your shareholders, because you have to protect that brand. You can look at the cash and you can see there's a figure attached to it that goes up or goes down, but by that same token, you can look at the perception of the brand and see whether it goes up and down, and recognizing that going down will ultimately mean that the cash in that profit line also will go down, because those two are related notions. So protecting that brand became an important part of preserving value for the corporation. Which then brings us to this guy. Who knows who this is? This is a little bit easier. Warren Buffett. That's right. Now you shout it right out. That's what this is meant for. This isn't a gotcha game. If you know it, shout it out. This is Warren Buffett, the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. One of the richest guys in the world, somebody who knows a thing or two about money. And those of you who have heard me present before have heard me use this quote before, because it really captures the essence of protecting that reputation and why it's important to do so. Warren Buffett said, it takes 20 years to build a reputation and just 5 minutes to ruin it. And if you think about that, you'll do things differently. Now, this is a guy, as I said, knows a thing or two about money. And when Warren Buffett speaks, I tend to agree with him. I think he got this mostly right, but I think he did make one mistake on this particular quote. Yes, it takes 20 years to build a reputation, but unfortunately nowadays, you can ruin it a lot faster than 5 minutes. Because of the ubiquity of social media, the Twitterverse and the Facebook space and the I don't know what, I can't even keep up with these platforms, it can take less than a minute to get some negative pictures or a video posted up there by some activist or some disgruntled employee, and the whole world knows it, goes viral. You cannot unring that bell anymore, and 20 plus years worth of hard work building up your reputation can be ruined in just seconds. And because that reputation forms the core of that intangible asset, the brand, the loyalty that you have built up to it, because that reputation is at the heart of that, protecting that reputation becomes extremely important for protecting your bottom line. That is the first cut at the business case for social responsibility as a risk mitigation factor to ensuring that that brand loyalty that you've built is something you can continue to draw upon instead of ruining it through bad, unsustainable, irresponsible sourcing practices. All right, who knows who this is? This one's a tough one. This is probably the hardest one on there. No takers, that's all right. This guy is the ex-CEO of a little company called Unilever, Neil Fitzgerald. They spell things weird in Ireland sometimes. I don't know why it's spelled that way, but that's how he spells his name. And Neil Fitzgerald, while still CEO of Unilever, said something that really captures the essence of this conversation very, very well. He said, corporate social responsibility is a hard-edged business decision. He wasn't one to mince words. This isn't a touchy-feely tree-hugger discussion. This is a hard-edged business decision. Not because it is a nice thing to do, or because people are forcing us to do it, but because it is good for our business. He was CEO of Unilever at the time he said this, as I said, and he was talking about their CSR program and casting it on a call with shareholders as a business decision. This is not something we're doing because people are forcing us to do it, which, by the way, they were, right? There's been campaigns against all kinds of different Unilever brands over the years. Not because it's a nice thing to do, right? apropos to the point Clay was making on the previous panel, the moral imperative for social responsibility is easy, right? You heard Pamela say, nobody wants to have their products made in a way that harms the people that are making it. The moral case is easy. Neil's point is, it's a business decision, right? And he's making that decision based on the calculus we just talked about with regards to Warren Buffett's previous quote, which is, look, you have to protect that reputation because that's what you have as a brand. That is ultimately why consumer picks your product versus the competitors, because that brand name means something to them, right? So that brings me then to the next idea of evolution of the bottom line, which is no longer simply that last line in the financial statement, but instead a move to what we're now calling the triple bottom line. You heard this referenced on the previous panel as well. This is the recognition that corporations no longer simply draw value or simply, are valued by what that last line on their financials is, but rather by the totality of their impact on the people, which is to say their employees and their supply chain, the planet, which is to say the environment, and let's not leave out the financials. The profit ultimately is important too, which is something that I really want to emphasize, right? Because a lot of the times, and the previous panel talked a little bit about this, a lot of the times you hear about how certain sustainable practices cost more, right? Whether it's the recyclable bags that Paul was using, which cost 7 cents more a unit or not, you want to make sure that that additional cost is bringing some value in return for it. Because believe me, the last thing that sustainability countenances is putting in place processes that cost so much more than they make, such that you end up running yourself out of business. There's no point being the nicest, most employee-friendly, most organic, most sustainable manufacturer out there if your costs end up putting you out of business. And all those workers have no jobs, all that environmental savings goes nowhere. You have to recognize that the triple bottom line has to be based on the profit motive still, but recognizing that there's value and then there is impact both from the people and the planet. And that then is the new bottom line. Which brings me to the last face I want to show you. Who knows who this is? Some of you might know this guy. This gentleman is Larry Fink. Now Larry Fink's not that famous, but BlackRock sure is. The world's largest asset management corporation in the world. And they invest in publicly traded stocks, obviously. And Larry Fink, in a letter he wrote earlier this year, in January of 2018, in a letter he wrote to the CEOs of all the public companies in which BlackRock owned stock, said the following: society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose. This is a guy who decides how much of a $1.6 trillion budget gets allocated to various corporations and various stocks. And he's making it clear that part of that decision is going to be based on whether or not the company serves a social purpose, which ties back to the question Tony was asking of the previous panel, right? Investors are now saying, how do I recognize the triple bottom line and direct my investments accordingly? Whether it is through things like types of scores he mentioned, or whether it's through other metrics that these organizations like BlackRock, like ICCR, like Trillium, other socially responsible investors are putting in place, are recognizing that for them as investors, as businessmen, mind you, BlackRock is not a tree-hugging organization. They're in it to make money. But they're recognizing that the smart way to make money is the long play that you heard referenced on the previous panel, not the squeeze every cent out of it today play, leaving nothing for tomorrow. But the long play, and the long play has to recognize that the bottom line is impacted by planet, issues and people issues as well as profit issues. So today, smart investors like Larry Fink, like Warren Buffett, smart CEOs like Neil Fitzgerald, and I would submit if he were still alive today, smart economists like Milton Friedman would recognize that the bottom line as a notion is evolving beyond simply the pure financial into recognizing that for you to be in the business, to be profitable long term, you have to look at it more holistically. You have to look at sustainability and responsible sourcing as business decisions, right? So that's sort of the bottom line of my presentation, which is that responsible sourcing ultimately is something that impacts your bottom line. And again, regardless of where you are in the supply chain, right? We've had presentations today that have focused more on sort of the bigger picture issue, less on the manufacturer's issue. But I want to be clear that this doesn't depend on where you are in the supply chain. This is not only a brand or retailer issue. Yes, that's where the reputation value ultimately comes to the fore, but it isn't. Just like Jeff said in his earlier presentation, technology, AI isn't something just for the retailers and the brands to worry about. Same thing here. Responsible sourcing isn't just for the buyers and the brands to worry about. This is something that you as manufacturers, as buyers, as general students of the space, designers, no matter where you are, it impacts you because your license to operate and therefore your ability to make a profit ultimately depends on whether you are doing so in a sustainable, socially responsible fashion. Right? So that's sort of my thesis. The question becomes, what should you do? Right? What's the point of having this notion put out there if we don't have, to Clay's point from the previous panel, a call to action? Well, the call to action is very simple. You need to make sure, again, regardless of where you are in the supply chain, that you have adopted responsible sourcing practices. And that ultimately, for that to have meaning, that these are credible, independently verified practices. So if you're a buyer, as you heard Giant Tiger say, the best way to do it is to use third-party organizations to validate your processes. If you're a manufacturer, make sure you are reaching out to those organizations, such as RAP, to be able to validate your practices and ensure that you have in place that credibility, that transparency to say, I am doing this, and it's not just me saying it, I'm having it independently verified by an organization that does that, that's their job, so that you, my customer, my stakeholder, my client, can rely on that assurance and know that I'm a good partner for you to work with. What does this mean in practice? At the end of the day, this is all good, big picture notions, but what does it mean in practice? Well, it means, again, to borrow from some notions that were raised on the previous panel, that you need to have a systemic approach to this issue, right? When Larry Fink writes that letter to the CEOs of the corporations that he's investing in, he's doing so to signal that a management change, a systemic change is necessary, because his organization is going to start now reviewing systemically the social purpose of the organizations they want to invest in. So you, CEO of publicly traded company, must now ensure that your management thinks about these things holistically, isn't simply reacting, isn't simply saying, well, if there's a problem, we'll deal with it, but rather putting in place proactive measures to prevent those problems from happening in the first place. So that next time around, when the decision cycle comes around and BlackRock has to allocate investment, they're not simply reacting to, the company's not reacting to that, but proactively saying, here's how we're managing it, we are the ones who should be investing in. So systemic approaches are necessary. And the same logic will apply at the factory level, right? You run a factory, you want to make sure you're putting in place appropriate health and safety and human rights and labor practices and recruitment practices to ensure that you are proactively preventing bad things from happening, not simply reacting to when they do happen, right? Again, Pamela mentioned the alliance and sort of the issue of fire safety in Bangladesh. One of the bigger challenges with the training that the Alliance and the Accord had to do over the last 5 years was getting factory owners and factory workers to shift their mentality from thinking about fire safety as an exercise in understanding what to do in the event of a fire, right? which is important, right? If there is a fire, you should know what to do. But shifting from that to thinking about how do you prevent fires from happening in the first place? That's the better exercise, right? Sure, if there is a fire, I should know what to do. But won't it be better to not have fires at all? That's the real way to think about this. That's the difference between a management systems proactive approach and a simply reactive approach to handling a problem if and when it comes up. You want to be in this camp. And again, whether you're a buyer or a retailer or a manufacturer or an agent or a designer, whichever you are, this thinking is something you have to start training yourself to do. What this means, again, practically, is you have to have commitment from the top. I love the question to Pamela, what did it take to make that polybags change? And the answer was simple. The person at the top, the one who ran the department, said, it will happen. And that drives everything else down the chain. It is a very basic sort of feature of human nature that we consider important the things that we believe our superiors, our supervisors consider important. If my boss thinks it matters, then it matters to me. Conversely, if it doesn't matter to the boss, I'm not going to be that particularly interested in paying attention to it. So in your organizations, the way to ensure that that systemic approach takes root, the way to ensure that sustainability becomes a practice as opposed to just something you do for PR purposes, is to make sure there is commitment from the top. Whether it's, again, the brand with the CEO or the board, and again, you saw Larry Fink's message to the CEOs of his companies, or whether it's the factory through the owner or general manager, making sure that they understand why this matters and driving it down through the rest of the organization. Then fundamentally, you need to be able to prove that you've got these practices and systems and commitment, and for that you're going to have some certain documentation. You want to make sure that the policies and procedures that you are being sort of proactively putting in place are indeed written, are properly documented, aren't simply figments of the owner's imagination or ideas in the manager's head, but actually documented and, more importantly, communicated. Because you at the top might have a vision and you might be truly committed to it, but if you don't put in place the directions for everybody below you to actually execute, then what might end up happening on the ground could be very different from what you had envisioned. You need to make sure that you explain what that policy means in reality. All right, your policy is you're not going to hire anybody below the minimum age. Great. When your hiring manager is told that policy, how is he or she going to execute it? Well, here's the steps we do to check for age. Here's the documents we use. We accept this kind of ID, not that kind of ID. You get my point. Provide the details of the documentation to actually make this in practice a reality. And most important, perhaps, certainly at the long-term assessment stage of any policy, is to make sure that you continuously educate all the people to whom it applies. Right? And again, this means not just workers at the factory, but also in a brand. Right? You heard a question asked at the previous panel. How do you get sourcing folks to come on board with this decision? Right? You have to educate. You have to continuously message and make sure that people understand why this matters. Right? This is the other thing that is a new way of thinking. Clay made the point on the last panel. The dictatorial way of doing things, where the brand would tell the buyer, the brand would tell the manufacturer, this is how it shall be, is passé. And that same logic applies within a factory, where management will tell workers, this is what's going to happen. Tell them why. Get them involved. Understanding why something is being asked of you is a much better way of getting you to do that thing than simply saying you have to because I say so. So that kind of thinking is extremely important. And so again, I quoted just one sentence from Larry Fink's letter it's worth reading the whole thing. He goes into a lot more detail as to why that matters. Likewise, the quote from Warren Buffett is also from a letter he wrote to shareholders of Berkshire Hathaway, explaining why. It's not simply just wisdom from on high, the sage of Omaha proclaiming knowledge. No, there's a reason behind it, and explain what they are. And what that means is ultimately training is key. Training your staff at the brand retailer level, training your workers at the factory level, training everybody in between so that the supply chain understands why these things matter. All right, so this is the part where I get to tell you a little bit about RAP. Right? I am the CEO of the organization. I have a captive audience, so I'm going to pitch it. So thank you for bearing with me on this. You've heard us described already as a certification standard. We are in fact the world's largest independent factory-based certification program for this industry, for the sewn product space, apparel, footwear, textile. RAP, as you know, stands for Worldwide Responsible Accredited Production, and the W is for worldwide. We inspect and certify factories all over the world. We call ourselves an objective, non-profit team of global social compliance experts. That's who we are. What we do is we promote safe, lawful, humane, and ethical manufacturing throughout the world. And how we do it is through certification primarily, and also education. As you've heard me say, it's critical to our overall mission. We have found that the most effective way to promote this mission is to engage with the industry directly, whether it's coming through trade shows like this one, talking to manufacturers, or engaging with the buyer side of the equation. The only way to really make a difference is to work with the folks that are actually doing the work itself, the sourcing itself. So we are proud partners of the American Apparel and Footwear Association. In fact, we are their corporate social responsibility partner. We also have a wonderful relationship with the Canadian Apparel Federation. You heard Bob Kirk earlier today. In general, our philosophy is that we want to work with industry, because at the end of the day, this is a business decision, as we've said now repeatedly. It's important for them to understand and for us to play an effective role by engaging with them. And we do so successfully, because as I said, we are the largest independent program in this space. I want to throw some numbers up there to validate that point. We're about halfway through 2018, but 2017 is a full year worth of figures there. Just to give you a sense of where our top factories are, the top 10. No surprise, again, you've heard the first panel of the day was how China continues to be the biggest apparel exporter in the world, and no surprises that that's where most of our factories are. And then you can see the other top 10, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, and so on. Again, these are the top importers into Canada, into the US, and in general, the top exporters on the planet. In 2017, RAP received 2,781 applications, and as of this point of the year, mid-2018, we have just over 2,400 factories holding current RAP certificates. Together they employ around 2.25 million workers, located in 42 countries around the world. I keep talking about the education part of it and how it's important to communicate, and we take that very seriously. Communication leadership is extremely important for us and a part of our success. We have a wonderful weekly newsletter, completely free, no ads, nothing, that goes out to 8,300 plus people around the world and has a very high click rate, which is amazing. More importantly, we have a website that serves as a great platform for dissemination of information, and we receive over 6,600 unique visitors every month. The website is available in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Bangla, and Chinese. And we're soon going to be adding a couple of more, German and Vietnamese as well, on there. So a very useful resource for your factories, no matter where they are in the world. And most importantly, our staff. We have full-time local staff in 8 different countries. And altogether among us, we speak 17 different languages. The whole point is to make sure we have, as a resource, somebody available in any part of the world where a factory can pick up the phone, call a local number, speak to somebody within their business hours in their own language, and be able to get the answers they need without having to wait for an email cycle or have to worry about things getting lost in translation. That's an important part of what we do and why we're so successful in what we do. So I wanted to make sure we save a lot of time for questions, so I'll conclude by essentially repeating my bottom line here. What now defines the bottom line is evolving, it's changing, and now it has come to a place where it expressly includes a social purpose. The triple bottom line is the way more and more investors are looking at companies to judge value. And so it's important that you, regardless of where you are in the supply chain, are acting, are sourcing, are manufacturing, are producing in a responsible fashion, because that will impact your bottom line. What that means then is that something like social compliance certification, something like what WRAP does, becomes very much a part of the global sourcing imperative. You heard the last panel say, product quality, price, and delivery are still, important, but you have to layer on top of that now responsible sourcing. Otherwise, they're not going to want to do business with you. And so, to end on a somewhat self-serving note, a properly implemented and credibly certified, in other words, a WRAP-validated, WRAP-certified factory is the way to make sure you are, on the manufacturing side, doing the things right, and on the buying side, sourcing responsibly in order to protect that bottom line and become a more profitable company that's in it for the long play and not simply trying to squeeze out every dollar just for the short-term earnings report. I will end it there. Thank you for your time and your patience, and I'm looking forward to some questions and having a conversation.
Thank you, Avedis. Oh, we got a question right over here.
Question in regards to your certifications. Now, do they have to recertify like every X amount of months or so? And now, how do you maintain those certifications? Because it's like, who's to say that they might just fake being sustainable for the week that you're there? Do you pop up and do like surprise inspections, or how do you go about doing that?
Great question. Thank you. I didn't go into too much detail because I didn't, necessarily want to spend most of my time talking about WRAP, but I appreciate the question and the chance to expound a little bit on it. So first and foremost, yes, it's a cycle. You don't just get it once and you're done. Typically annually, every year they'll come back and they'll get recertified. So there's one protection right there, right? So you're going in on an annual basis. But to your point, what do you know about what happens between those visits? How can we make sure that the factory isn't, sprucing itself up for the audit, and then once the auditors leave, they go back to being bad and unsustainable? Well, two answers to that. One, the audit itself is designed not to simply be a checklist, right? We're not just going into the factory and looking around saying, all right, there's the exit, there's the fire extinguisher, there's the payroll, and check, check, check. Rather, we're looking, as I mentioned, for management systems. We're looking to understand, all right, how do you train your workers to make sure to know which exit to go to in an emergency? Who is responsible for that fire extinguisher and replenishing it every month? Okay. Who maintains the payroll register, and how do they know what their job is, and how do you make sure that job is being performed effectively? So we're going in to try to get some sense of comfort that they are systemically handling these things and not simply making it look nice for the visit. That's one. Two, every factory that gets WRAP certified is subject to what we call post-certification audits, PCAs. And those are, to the point you were making, surprise visits. Even the initial audit, by the way, is unannounced. So they don't know when we're coming. There'll be a window of time, a 1-month window of time, where they know the audit will take place, but they won't know exactly when, which is also meant to cut down on the risk of them setting it up just for that visit. But even doing that, and even doing the systemic approach, we still go in and do surprise inspections, and we do this about 20% of our factories all over the world. In some high-risk countries, it's closer to 100% because of that high risk. But that's the whole idea, is to keep them honest and make sure that they're not forgetting the promise they made to us when we certified them to keep those systems running on a regular basis. Thank you for that question. Great stuff.
Over here, Avedis. So staying with the PCA for a second. So my sourcing team is traveling on a trip, and they're going to visit our important vendors in China, in Bangladesh, in India, doesn't matter. And on this trip, they encounter some significant violations to the RAP code, and we use RAP as our standard. Maybe it's underage labor in the packing area, maybe it's locked exit doors, maybe it's just the lack of the mesh gloves that the handheld cutting room people are using. So what would be your recommendation for protocol for a facility that we thought was RAP certified, but my team is finding these violations?
Great, thanks for that question. It's a great question for two reasons, and I'll start with the second reason first. It gives me a chance to make a recommendation to anybody in here that's in the sourcing space. More and more, we're recognizing that auditors are not going to be able to capture everything, both because they're only there, once or twice or thrice a year, and because the audit's a sample. But the folks who are in the factories far more frequently are the sourcing folks, the QA guys. Those guys are in the factories much more regularly, much more frequently. And so our advice to everybody out there is, make sure your sourcing guys, while they're not social compliance auditors, have some basic understanding of what responsible manufacturing practices are, so that when they do see, during a sourcing visit, things that ought to raise flags, they can then be the eyes and ears of the brand in the factory and raise those flags. And so that's the second part of the question, which is, what is the protocol in that case? Absolutely, we want to know, right? I mean, RAP is certifying a factory, and that certificate, as I mentioned, essentially brings with it a promise on the part of the factory that they will continue to maintain those practices. But factories are dynamic places, things change, we're human, mistakes can happen, even unwittingly. So we want to know about those things because we want to then be able to address them directly with the factory. Some of these things are solvable, right? You've got many instances of factories that have in place personal protective equipment policies, PPE, that says you have to wear that mesh glove. But they don't do a very good job training the workers when it comes to maintaining that policy. And partly it's because they don't explain the reason why. The worker's being told you have to do it. But without a proper understanding, it's not hard to imagine them saying, well, no one's around, I'm not going to do it. Whereas if you explain to them why that matters, and in that case, it's a fairly easy explanation, right? Show a couple of pictures of what happens to people who did not use those gloves and got their fingers caught in that cutter, and that'll really change people's minds. I've seen a factory in, it was India actually, that was having trouble getting their workers to use eye guards on the sewing machines. And so all it took was a simple session showing them a couple of pictures of what a broken needle did to somebody's eye, and the workers were like, oh, I don't want that to happen to me. But it was simply a matter of educating them, understanding why that matters, as opposed to imposing that on them. Now, I would encourage folks who see these to come to us for another reason as well. Sometimes sourcing people don't want to share that information because they are afraid that the factory will get decertified, there'll be negative consequences, and that impacts their sourcing ability. Our philosophy at RAP is, as long as the factory truly is willing to work and is understanding why this matters, we would much rather engage with them, help them improve, and get the corrective actions implemented rather than just decertify them. Because disengaging doesn't make things better, right? Now there are situations where if the factory is deliberately hiring children or beating them or lying to us and in some ways, not somebody we want to work with, then we're left with no choice but to decertify. But to the extent possible, we want to work with them, to help them, to get them to where they are, where they need to be. And so we've very much encourage and hope for people to let us know when they see these things so we can make a difference. So, great question, thank you. There's one here, then there, and then Tony has one as well. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering if you can point me to any accreditation organization like yours that actually certifies that textiles are manufactured ethically. I know you do for the manufacturing, but I haven't found a lot for just the textiles themselves.
So if you're talking about social responsibility part of ethic, I mean, the workers are being treated well, then we can do textiles as well. So we're in the sewn product space from textiles onwards, from yarn forward, to talk about rules of origin. So we're happy to do that. If you're looking for someone to examine the environmental aspects of the textile manufacturing, Ecotex has a booth here, and there are other organizations that do that. But on the human side, labor side, RAP is the one I would point you to for obvious reasons. Yes, ma'am.
Comment? Sorry. Here you go.
Jason's getting his steps in today.
Well, just to add on to that question, then for animal purposes, like let's say sources of merino wool or sheep farms, are there any organizations that certify?
There are organizations that specialize in certain kinds of animal products. So there's a responsible down, for example, that deals with that particular piece. There is a responsible leather initiative that is handling leather. I don't know if there is the same people that have the responsible down standard also have responsible wool. In fact, there is, for merino, there's an Australian-based organization that has, I'm trying to remember now what's it called, but there are individual organizations. So if there's a particular fiber you're interested in, let me know and I can maybe look it up and give you more detailed information. Yes, ma'am.
The textile exchange is...
The textile exchange is the one that does the responsible down and responsible wool, and also the responsible leather initiative is part of the textile exchange as well.
Could you talk a bit about navigating the cultural differences between, say, the top 10 and how RAP has gone about creating a management system for entering new markets?
So that is an excellent question. I mentioned that one of the things that we've concentrated on with regards to growing our staff is to ensure that we have local staff, and I said the reason for that was to ensure that folks can pick up a phone, dial a local number, and talk to somebody who speaks their own language. And all that's true, but another very important reason for that is because those cultural differences are significant, and the way you communicate isn't simply a matter of language, but a matter of how you explain things and how you focus on which direction to sort of tackle the issue from. Sort of a negative version of this that illustrates this is a true story about this. Again, it's from India. Garment factory owner in the South, who was dealing with a major U.S. brand, and he was a good supplier. Generally treated his workers well. The problem the brand had with this factory, and this was not a RAP factory. I was told the story as an example of why RAP is a good thing. You should have factories be RAP factories. Was that he did not seem to think fire safety was important. And his position was, he was a religious man, prayed to God all the time, and there would be no fire in his factory. That was his position, and so he wasn't going to invest in, expensive retrofitted sprinklers and the like. How do you argue with that? Well, the arguments didn't last very long until there was a fire in his factory. Fortunately for him, which he ascribed again to him being a religious person, it was at night, so nobody was hurt. Some, damage to equipment and some loss of inventory, but no loss of life. At which point, the brand then told him, look, now do you see why it's important? Now will you invest? And his response was, now it's totally unnecessary. There's already been a fire in the factory. It's not going to happen again. True story, right? So it's very hard to have this conversation without becoming aware of the cultural context. And so we take it seriously, and we want to invest in people so you can have the conversation in a way that you are not only speaking their language, but speaking their language in the vernacular cultural sense of the word, right? And that's where it can be difficult. So in my experience, let me switch to Bangladesh, for example. Bangladesh gets a bad rap, and perhaps some of it is deserved, right? Rana Plaza was in Bangladesh, but it's also a place where I've seen a lot of really good factories. And what's interesting is there's almost a dividing line that you can count on. Those factories that are still run by the first generation of owners tend to behave a certain way, whereas the ones that are not being run by the children of those owners, who, because of all the money they made, were able to send them to the West for MBAs from Wharton or Oxford or wherever, now come back with a very different mindset. So that mindset is at the heart of it, right? Show me an owner who cares, and I'll show you a good factory, no matter where in the world it exists. Show me an owner who doesn't, and that's going to be a bad factory, even if it's here in Toronto or in the United States or anywhere else in the world. So that cultural point is extremely important. So we make sure that we try to put in that sensitivity, both from our staff perspective, also ensure that all our audits are done by local auditors. I'm not sending someone from Arlington to go do an audit in Bangladesh. It's somebody who's from Bangladesh who understands the culture, the language, the laws, and is able to make that connection and make that explanation. So it's an extremely important part, and it's a great question. I appreciate it. Tony.
Tess. Avedis, I noticed you're based in Washington, or you have an office there.
Yep.
No small coincidence that trying to get government or somebody to put a label on products is a challenge. There's labels in food industry. We have R2 certification in electronics, UL Underwriter Labs, UL CLA. Those labels mean something at some point. When do you envision some country or company, retailer, becoming adamant about a label on the apparel that gives the story? Because yours is still on the manufacturing side.
Correct.
When is it happening at the consumer, so they go in the store anywhere in the world and there's a label on there that says something, or a logo?
Yeah.
Is that happening?
Yeah, that is a great question. So the short answer is it's happening, but maybe not necessarily as straightforwardly as a label. You heard, again, Anouk on the previous panel talk about how it is a trend that certainly millennials want to know more about where the product's coming from. So you're seeing, for example, some companies have QR codes attached, maybe not to the product, but at the point of sale, where you can scan and get the story behind it. You're seeing some. You heard Paul talk about the woman who live streamed her factory visits in Bangladesh, her sourcing trip. So there is some of that happening. Are we going to get to where it's going to be on the product label? To some extent, the increased technology, the stuff that Jeff talked about earlier today, is going to make that easier. He referenced blockchain, and I think that if we are able to get to where you can validate a claim of responsible sourcing, whether from an environmental or a social point of view, from start to finish, then a brand might feel comfortable putting it on the label. Because otherwise, you run into some risks, right? Once you put it on there, especially in a litigious country like ours, south of this border, particularly California, any claim you make, you're going to have to be able to you own that claim. So if you're saying this was responsibly sourced, then it's not simply a question of whether the factory that assembled it treated its workers right. What about the guys that loaded it on the boat? What about the boat itself? What about the guys at the dock? What about the truck driver? What about the guy at the store? So there's a lot of competing claims that make it hard for the final product to be finally labeled at the point of sale. So that's going to evolve. Until then, you'll get bits and pieces of it through those QR codes, through some of the storytelling. Fundamentally, though, we continue to occupy, as you said, the space at the manufacturer level. We're not consumer facing. The buyer, the brand, the retailer knows to ask for wrap of the factory that's doing the final assembly. And to the other question, you can go back to textiles and follow the same pattern there. But to be able to have a complete supply chain validation all the way to point of sale, that's going to take some doing. And so the short answer was yes, it's happening. The long answer is it's going to take a while, and it might not look like a straightforward label at the end of it all. Another great question. I thought I saw a hand over here. Yeah, I did.
Hey, hello.
How you doing?
Maybe it's not too much relevant, but I was a social compliance monitor in Bangladesh.
Okay.
So, do you have any complaint cell, like anonymous complaint cell, that you guys go and do the audit in the factory, right?
Right.
And you mostly deal with the management.
Yep.
So, I'm not sure, like, if you have any complaint, anonymous complaint, customer department or customer service, they can make a complaint, like serious
Sure.
violation, maybe in child labor,
Sure.
maybe like not paying on time, or something like that. You know?
Absolutely. That's a great question. We have an intake space on the website that you can send an email anonymously, and we get those all the time. But also, whenever we do an audit, if we're the ones doing it directly or whether it's one of our third-party partners doing it, part of the audit is to inform the workers that if there's something they don't want to say right there or are uncomfortable saying right there, they can contact us off-site, either RAP directly or, as I said during the audit, the auditor themselves or the audit firm themselves. So we have the mechanisms in place to get anonymous complaints, and we do get them all the time. We have to investigate each one. Sometimes there is some real substance to it, and we take a lot of action. A lot of times, the information doesn't pan out, but the mechanism is there in place for those complaints to be received. That's an important part of any system out there. Great.
Okay.
Very good.
We're out of time at this point. But,
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of your stay here.